In November 1963, inspectors climbed onto 37 storage tanks in Bayonne, New Jersey, expecting to find 1.8 billion pounds of vegetable oil. They found seawater. A thin skin of real oil floated on top of each tank, just deep enough to fool a dipstick. Underneath it, salt water pumped in from the harbor outside. The paper trail said the oil was worth $150 million. It was worth almost nothing. Most people have never heard this story. It happened the same week President Kennedy was shot, and the news never recovered its oxygen. If that interests you, subscribe, because this channel covers what most people slept through. By 1962, Anthony Tino De Angelis ran one of the largest vegetable oil operations in the country, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation, based on the docks of Bayonne, New Jersey. He wasn't born into this. He grew up in the Bronx, the son of Italian immigrants, and started out cutting meat in a hog processing plant. By the 1950s, he built and lost a meat company after a government contract fraud scandal. He didn't stay down. He pivoted straight into vegetable oil, soybean, and cottonseed, and set his sights on cornering the market. Cornering a market means buying so much of a commodity that you control the price. To do it, De Angelis needed cash, and lots of it. So he used a financing tool that Wall Street trusted completely: warehouse receipts. A warehouse receipt is a document that says this much of a physical good sits in this tank, and it belongs to whoever holds this paper. Banks would lend against those receipts, using the oil itself as collateral. It's how commodity financing had worked for a century, and almost nobody thought to question it. The receipts issued for Allied's tanks carried one more thing that made lenders comfortable: the name American Express. A subsidiary called American Express Warehousing certified that the oil in those tanks was real. Once that name was stamped on the paperwork, banks and brokers lined up. Exporters lent first, then brokerage houses. Then over 50 banks, foreign and domestic, all convinced they were financing the largest private oil reserve in America. On paper, Allied looked unstoppable, an empire built on liquid gold sitting in New Jersey harbor tanks. Here is what the receipts didn't show. De Angelis built a network of more than 70 interconnected tanks. Some held real oil. Most didn't. His crews ran pipes between tanks so that when an inspector arrived to check tank number 12, workers could pump oil from tank number 9 into it minutes ahead of the visit, and pump it right back out once the inspector moved on. The same few thousand gallons of real oil got recycled from tank to tank, tank after tank, inspection after inspection. For tanks that couldn't be topped up in time, De Angelis had a simpler fix: seawater, oil floats. A few feet of real oil sitting on top of a tank full of harbor water reads the same as a full tank to a dipstick measurement taken from above. Federal investigators later found that at the height of the scheme, the volume of oil American Express Warehousing was certifying exceeded the entire vegetable oil reserves of the United States. Nobody caught it because nobody thought to check. De Angelis also went further than fake tanks. He got hold of blank American Express receipt forms and started forging his own, never even routing them through the real inspection process. According to court records from the case, he was eventually charged with 19 counts of fraud and conspiracy for forging warehouse receipts. The scheme worked because of one basic assumption baked into the entire financial system: that a piece of paper with a trusted name on it means the thing it describes actually exists. In commodity finance, almost nobody physically checks. They check the paperwork about the thing, not the thing itself. To the public, and to most of Wall Street, Allied crude vegetable oil looked like a rising empire, not a fraud in progress. De Angelis was buying soybean oil and soybean futures aggressively, and for a while, the market believed he had good reason to. There was active speculation in 1963 that the United States was about to strike a major grain and oil trade deal with the Soviet Union, the kind of deal that would send soybean oil prices climbing. De Angelis' buying looked like conviction, not desperation. Traders read his confidence as market intelligence. It was the opposite. He needed prices to keep rising because he was borrowing against collateral that barely existed, and every new loan depended on the illusion holding. When talks on that agricultural trade deal collapsed, soybean oil prices dropped instead of rising. De Angelis was left holding massive futures positions moving against him, still borrowing to cover margin calls, still pledging tanks of seawater as collateral for the next loan. The gap between the official story, a savvy commodities baron cornering a market, and the internal reality. A man drowning in fraudulent paper, keeping the scheme alive, one forged receipt at a time, had never been wider. In December, Allied's warehouse manager checked the company's actual cash position. He found $6 in petty cash and just over $6,000 in the bank. A company that had borrowed against $150 million in supposed inventory had almost nothing. On December 2, 1963, the Wall Street Journal broke the story publicly. 10 days earlier, President Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, and the country's attention was still consumed by it. The unraveling of one of the largest commodity frauds in American history happened almost in the shadows of a national tragedy, and the story never got the coverage it would have gotten in any other week. The numbers, once they came out, were staggering. Allied's collapse triggered roughly $180 million in losses, worth close to $1.9 billion today. American Express alone absorbed losses of around $58 million through its warehousing subsidiary. By mid-1965, 16 companies tied to the scandal had gone bankrupt, including 2 respected Wall Street brokerage firms, Ira Haupt & Company and J.R. Williston & Bean, both destroyed by their exposure to Allied. Banks from Bank of America to Continental Illinois took losses. Foreign banks in London and beyond had been drawn in too. De Angelis was charged, pled guilty in 1965, and was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He served about 7 before his release in 1972. American Express stock, meanwhile, had been cut roughly in half. There's one more figure buried in this story that most retellings skip past. When American Express stock collapsed, a young investor named Warren Buffett looked at the wreckage and made a different bet, not on the warehousing subsidiary that had been defrauded, but on the traveler's check and charge card business underneath it, which he judged to be fundamentally sound. He put roughly 40% of his investment partnership's capital into American Express stock in 1964. It became one of the most celebrated early trades of his career, and it happened because he was willing to look past a headline fraud to the asset underneath it. But the deeper lesson of the salad oil swindle isn't about Buffett, it's about paperwork. The scandal forced regulators to require simultaneous inspection of every tank in a warehousing network, so oil couldn't be pumped from tank to tank ahead of inspectors. It forced tighter separation between the companies that issue warehouse receipts and the banks that lend against them. And yet the core vulnerability De Angelis exploited, that lenders trust documents describing an asset far more than they verify the asset itself, never actually went away. In 2014, at Qingdao Port in China, a metals trading firm was found to have used the exact same trick on a modern digital financial system, duplicating warehouse receipts for the same stockpiles of copper and aluminum, and pledging those same metals as collateral for more than $2.5 billion in loans from over a dozen banks, Chinese and international. Different commodity, different century. Same seawater trick, just with metal instead of oil. This is the reason financial regulators still talk about Qingdao risk in trade finance today, because the swindle in a New Jersey harbor in 1963 proved something about how modern finance works that nobody has ever fully fixed. If the paperwork says it's there, almost nobody checks. Most people slept through this. You didn't. Subscribe, because there's more.